Now we've descended and we're 1,000 feet above the airport elevation. We're where we want to be, and it now comes time for the in-range check. The in-range check is a check that is used to set the airplane up to the approach configuration. It'll slow us down and it will set us up for landing. So we're ready for our in-range check. Within 5 miles of the airport is a typical place where you would set it up in a DC-3. And the captain announces in-range check. He moves the throttles to about 25 inches of manifold pressure. The in-range check to the co-pilot automatically means flaps 1/4. So he'll reach over to the flap handle and lower the flaps back to neutral to 1/4. And that flap indicator in the R4D is over here on the left of the instrument panel in front of the pilot, just right on the sidewall. Flaps are at 1/4. The next check is hydraulic pressures. We should be seeing 800 psi on our hydraulic system gauge. We would look just behind the flap indicator or flap handle and landing gear handle on the aft bulkhead to the sight gauge and make sure that we have hydraulic quantity in the tank. It's a sight gauge, just like almost like in the fuel oil in your household furnace. We checked that the parking brake didn't inadvertently get set to the on position while we were in flight. We checked that the tail wheel is locked. The mixtures are auto lean. We've checked our temperatures and pressures. We've set our no smoking and seatbelt signs on the overhead as appropriate. We've checked our fuel selectors, and there's really, in the DC-3, there's no restrictions of where the fuel selectors have to be or which tanks have to be used for takeoff and or landing. So merely the fullest tanks are used. So you can set the fuel selectors to the fullest tanks for landing. And we're ready for our approach. So we've turned to the downwind, and we've flown a pretty standard downwind. We're not real wide, we're not real close and tight in on top of the airport. Our power is at 25 inches, and our propellers are still set at 2,050 RPM. The pilot calls to the co-pilot landing check, excuse me, which automatically means landing gear to the down position. Co-pilot reaches around with his left hand and pushes the landing gear handle to the full down position and waits. And what we'll see happening is we'll see on the right hand panel, we'll see the hydraulic gauge begin to cycle in spurts, and we'll see the landing gear pressure begin to rise. And when both gauges stabilize, the main system gauge at 800 psi and a landing gear pressure gauge at 800 psi, and they're both equal, he returns the landing gear handle to the neutral position, and he reaches down on the floor to the left of the pilot's seat, and he pushes the lock handle down to the lock position and puts a little saddle over top of it to lock it. At this point, there'll be a green light indicated for the landing gear, meaning that it's locked on the instrument panel. That's called the positive lock. Boost pumps are brought on. Co-pilot is doing that. Carburetor heat is cold or as required. The cowl flaps now go to the trail position. The reason they're put in the trail position is to set us up for a go-around in case we have to abort our landing. Okay, we've locked the landing gear, we've checked the boost pumps, we've checked the carburetor heat, we've put the cowl flaps into the trail position, and by this time we're probably ready to turn from the downwind to the base, and the captain will call for the co-pilot to move the flaps as he desires. Typically they're at 1/4 on the downwind. We set them there and are in range. Now it's time to turn to the base. The captain turns base, and he calls for half flaps. Co-pilot moves the flaps to half. Captain adjusts his airspeed. There are limitations, airspeed limitations, for the various flap settings. For instance, at a quarter flaps, 135 knots. At half flaps, 99 knots. And at three-quarter flaps, 97 knots. In the R4D, the warning is placarded down here in the bottom of the instrument panel below the section gauge. And it's the captain's responsibility. He sets his airspeed, and he's below 99 knots. He calls for half flaps. We're flying through the base, and we're at the end of the base. Typically, if I were piloting at this point at the end of the base, I would call for, and prior to turning final, I would call for three-quarter flaps. Co-pilot would move the flaps to three-quarter. My airspeed at this point, I'm probably at 95 knots. And I make the left turn to final approach. And I want to fly a stabilized final. I have not had to do anything with my power. I have not had to do anything probably with my throttle settings. And now, depending on where my altitude is as I'm turning final approach, and I should be at somewhere about 500 feet above the ground, I've rolled out on final, and I call for full flaps. Co-pilot adjusts the flaps to full and announces landing check complete.